Okay, y'all, we're back and ready for chapter 1. So I'm going to review the questions for chapter 1 right now with you. I am figuring out how to move my camera over so that I am able to read. Here we are. Okay, so the questions for chapter 1. Choose 3 character traits Charlotte displays and evidence from the text to support it. So remember, character traits describe the way that someone's behavior is. So in the example, I put courageous, generous, respectful, honest, confident. Respectful again, I need to go back and fix that. So make sure that you pay attention to how she is acting. And then it also says, use evidence from the text to support it. So you want to make sure you prove with something from the text why you know that. So if you said that she showed honesty, well, show me an example of how she was honest. Okay, so there should be a whole sentence there, a complete sentence that describes, actually there should be 3. Okay. Next, it says, choose a character trait and give evidence for these characters. So here you can choose one word to describe these people. You have Mrs. Boyle, Vern, William, Mrs. Milshark, and Hayward. So describe those people in a word. The last question says, describe how each horse received its name. So remember to restate that. Your sentences should say something like, each horse received its name by, okay? So make sure you practice everything that we've learned in the classroom. You know, up until this year, we're expecting 4th grade level sentences, y'all, okay? All right, chapter 1 from Writing Freedom. After 10 years at the orphanage, Charlotte wasn't like most girls her age. And who knew if it growing... Sometimes you just need to restart. Let me start that sentence. And who knew if it was growing up like a fellow along puppy in the pack of Rafarian boys, or if it was just her own spit and fire. So she grew up with a whole bunch of boys. But she never had a doll or a tea party. She couldn't sew or stitch, and she didn't know a petticoat from a pea pod. Wild hair sprang out of her brown braids, and her ribbons dangled to her waist untied. Her frock was too big and hung like a sack on her small frame. Those are her clothes. Smudges of dirt always covered her, and instead of a girl-like lace, for as long as anyone could remember, she wore a strip of leather rein tied around her wrist. So far, Charlotte's not like most girls. Back in this time period, they all kind of looked a certain way. They had really high expectations for how they acted and how they looked. And so far, she's not fitting that category. All right. Charlotte's greatest misfortune was that Mrs. Boyle, the cook who had been in charge of her, with the shape and personality of a very large toad, and without a mothering bone in her body, Mrs. Boyle certainly wasn't going to teach Charlotte how to be ladylike. She couldn't be bothered with Charlotte except to order her around in the kitchen. And although Charlotte knew how to boil oats and make mush for an army, and she could peel mountains of potatoes and scrub pots and pans, Mrs. Boyle still yelled at her for the littlest things. For being too noisy, or for being too quiet, or for gazing out of the window at some horse in the pasture that needed to be ridden. Being in the kitchen was a thorn in Charlotte's side, and she hated it worse than falling in a real briar patch. A briar patch is like thorns, and it would really hurt. Every day Charlotte did her chores in the kitchen as fast as she could, and then she hung up her apron and headed out for the only place that made her really happy, the stables. Today Charlotte hurried there with one thing on her mind, winning the pasture race. Every day Charlotte did her chores in the kitchen as fast... I already read that part, sorry. As soon as Charlotte approached, the horses started moving toward their gates and hanging their heads over to be petted. The smell of the sweet hay in the horses comforted her like an old quilt on a cold day. The elderly stable master was raking the stalls. "Hi, Vern. Is Freedom ready for the race?" Miss Charlotte, that horse is always ready to run, and as much as she takes a shine to you, I expect you could take her to the moon and back." Vern was tall and he was thin, with leathery skin, the color of coffee with no milk at all. He tended the stables with quite a gentle gesture. He didn't talk much to anyone else, but he loved to tell Charlotte stories, most of them were true, that left her with a spell of her mouth wide open. Vern had named all of the horses himself. Pay attention here, I know this is a question. He always said that naming something was important, that the name ought to stand for something, and that the horses should have a fine name fit for a fine animal. So the horses all had names like Justice and Hope and Charity, and Vern had a story that went with every one of those names. Hope for wanting a better life when he was a young slave on a plantation in Virginia. Charity, because of the kindness of the people who helped him through his struggles. But the story that Charlotte begged for the most was about Freedom. Freedom was Charlotte's favorite horse. She had watched her birthing a few years ago and had babied her ever since. It was Freedom that Vern taught Charlotte how to ride on. She often pestered Vern for a story about Freedom's name. The story of how Vern ran away and hid in a root cellar with nothing but an old shirt to keep him warm. He ran all the way north so that he could be free, and he named a horse Freedom for something that he won. "You gonna beat William in the race today?" asked Vern. "I aim to. He deserves to be taken down a peg." William was 13, and he bullied the younger boys. He threw rocks at the cats and the kittens, and he whipped the horses, and he couldn't stand that Charlotte was better than he was at climbing trees and riding horses. "I expect you will," said Vern. "Freedom trusts you. William's riding Justice, and Justin just as soon threw him off. That boy is full of no respect for horses. You know what I always say." Charlotte knew in her heart. "A horse rides the way that it's written," Charlotte said. Vern nodded his head, and Charlotte led Freedom from the last stall. Now it's a scene change. The pasture fence was already lined with boys sitting on top of the rail waiting for the races to start. Mr. Milshark, the overseer, walked up and down in front of the starting line waiting for the riders. He was the shortest, fattest, most mean-spirited man that Charlotte had ever known. His beard and hair were almost the same color as his dimpled white skin, and he reminded Charlotte of a plump potato. Mr. Milshark was in his glory during the pasture races. Instead of his usual scowling self, he paraded around with a smile on stuck on his face, clapping people on the back and shaking hands all around. This was an opportunity to show off and let people think that the orphanage was a decent place with happy children. But Charlotte and the others knew the truth. The orphanage was nothing more than a work farm, and no matter how young, every child worked hard. Mr. Milshark saw to that. Charlotte walked toward the pasture, leading Freedom on a halter. The horse nudged her as if it was to hurry along. The boys from town laughed when they saw Charlotte. She ignored them and headed toward the starting line until William and a group of boys blocked her way. "No girls allowed," said William. Charlotte tightened her fist and she planted her feet. She pursed her lips and she glared with piercing blue eyes. "Get out of my way, William," she said. Some of the boys stepped back. They had seen that look before. With disgust, he said, "Suit yourself, but you'll be sorry." The riders mounted and readied their horses. Mr. Milshark raised the flag. "Go!" he yelled. The riders hollered at their horses and they pressed them into a running. Charlotte let Freedom start out slowly, saving her spurt for near the finish. William was close behind. Soon the two of them rode neck and neck. But in the second lap, Charlotte let William take the lead. Charlotte knew her horses. Justice was a Doblin, gentle at heart and didn't take kindly to being ridden hard. William was pressing him, and the poor horse would tire out soon. As they approached the final turn, Charlotte gave Freedom full rein. In a blinding gallop, with her long braids waving behind her like two thick ropes, she passed William and crossed the finish line 2 lengths ahead of him. The townspeople clapped, and Charlotte heard the boys from the orphanage give a wild cheer. She knew why. Most of them had bet on money that she would win. Charlotte slowed Freedom and walked her around the pasture. The horse was breathing heavy and wheezing. She lathered more than usual and felt warm, too warm. Vern should take a look at her tonight, thought Charlotte. As she got near the fence, a man and woman waved at her. "Hey there," called the man. "Hello," said Charlotte. "You're a good rider," said the woman. "Thank you, ma'am," said Charlotte. "So you like horses?" "Yes, sir. I might more than most people." The man and woman laughed. Worried about Freedom, Charlotte said, "I have to go now," and she headed away toward the barn. Charlotte patted Freedom's neck. "You okay, girl?" William caught up to Charlotte. "You come to congratulate me, William?" "I hope you like winning, because that's the last race you'll ever run." "How you gonna stop me, William?" "I got my ways. And like I said before, you'll be sorry." "I ain't got time for you, William. I got a sick horse that needs tending to." And Charlotte rode ahead. But what William said needled her, and when she glanced back, she didn't like what she saw. William was talking to Mr. Milshark, and Mr. Milshark was patting him on the back and listening with a concerned look on his face. Vern was worried about Freedom. The last few days she had been acting kind of funny and hasn't been eating like usual. But it didn't seem nothing serious. "She doesn't look good now, though. Let's put her to bed," he said. Sorry, I lost my place. And as they rubbed her down, Freedom tried to nip at her own stomach. "Maybe it's just a touch of colic," Vern reassured Charlotte. By the time they got her into the stall, Freedom fell to her knees and she laid down. "I'm going to go get some water for her fever," said Vern. He wouldn't say so, but Charlotte knew that it was serious. She knelt down next to her horse, stroking her head. Freedom lay motionless, except for her labored breathing. Charlotte swallowed hard to keep back her tears. "Charlotte! Where are you, Charlotte?" "Over here, Hay." Hayward was 2 years younger, and from the day that he arrived in the orphanage, he latched on to Charlotte. He was persistent and friendly and talked so much that Charlotte often thought that he might choke on his own words. Did you hear what it described Hayward like? Friendly. That's a really good character trait word. So as I'm describing these new characters, make sure you're listening for that. Okay. With hair the color of turnips and ears as big as saucers, he was about the homeliest thing that she had ever seen. Although Charlotte sometimes pretended to be annoyed when he pestered her, she didn't really mind. Besides, he needed her. One afternoon 3 years ago, soon after Hayward arrived at the orphanage, Charlotte had been walking behind the barn and found him taking on William and 2 other older boys. "Where'd you get those ears?" Was your mama an elephant?" yelled William. "Can you even hear out of those things, or are they just for decoration?" What does your girlfriend Charlotte think about them ears?" Hayward was bloody and he was bruised, but he was still fighting with every nerve, with a never-give-up look in his eyes when Charlotte dove in. The 3 boys left in worse shape than Hayward, and Hayward and Charlotte had been left with each other. They had been best friends ever since. And there's a scene change here, y'all, so I'm going to actually pause and finish uploading this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one since our time is about to run out, okay? And we'll finish out the chapter. It's just a couple more pages. See y'all in the next video.